Tonight, we're going to have a look at some images of the Battle of Arras. We've had two previous chats about official photography and official photographs of the Battle of the Somme. We looked at the very first day of the Battle of the Somme, and then we looked at the end of the Battle of the Somme as well in November of 1916. And I had quite a lot of positive feedback about those, and I think it's quite a good idea to kind of keep that going because I find it quite interesting in pulling these images out, putting a talk together based around them, and having a look at kind of what it tells us really about that aspect of the Great War and some of those many layers of the subject. So tonight we're going to look at the Battle of Arras in April 1917 and concentrate on that first day of the Battle of Arras. But as always, we will kind of have a lead into it, and it doesn't kind of entirely sit in isolation. So using, in this case, not just official images, I've got one or two from my own archives that I've put into here. Hopefully, I'll give us a bit of an idea of what that opening phase of Arras was all about, and we'll see what these photographs tell us about that. But before we get to Arras, of course, we have to connect up the bits from where we last were. So we were on the Somme in November 1916. The Battle of the Somme was coming to an end with the Battle of the Ancre, an advance over the Ancre Heights. For the men on the ground, did it really feel like an end? I suspect not. Many of those who were in units like the 18th Eastern Division that stayed on the Somme until the German withdrawal in 1917, it would have just felt like the battle continued, but with far less fighting. But historians are there to understand the past, often delineate the past, and the battle's nomenclature committee after the war broke the First World War, Great War, up into sections, of which the Battle of the Somme and its many battles within it are all part of that. And officially, the Battle of the Somme comes to an end on the 18th of November. And while there are several actions on the Somme front during the winter of 1916-17, from a British perspective, on the other side of no man's land, from the German point of view, they have realised that essentially they've lost the Battle of the Somme. The British had not broken through. The French, despite their greater numbers towards the end of the campaign, haven't entirely broke through in that area. But what the Germans are left holding in that ground south of Arras, down towards the area of the Somme River Valley, close to Peronne, for example, they're holding a line that really, it isn't possible to hold that indefinitely. And if they sit there and just do nothing, then the British and the French are going to muster for another offensive the following year and almost certainly will break through, and who knows what can happen then. So a conscious decision was made to withdraw from the Somme front and build a new system of trenches. The Hindenburg Line, as the British and Commonwealth forces, Empire forces called it, the Siegfriedstellung, as the Germans called it, not to be confused with the Siegfried Line of the Second World War. There was no washing hanging on it or anything like that. But through a misinterpretation of intelligence documents, the British thought that the Siegfriedstellung was actually the Hindenburgstellung, and that's how the Hindenburg Line got its name, and that's kind of what it's been referred to really ever since, certainly from an English language point of view. And the Germans decided that once that was built, they would simply give up the ground that they'd left on the Somme and pull back. And that began in February of 1917 with the beginning of Operation Alberich, where the Germans are pulling back in an orderly fashion, not just abandoning the ground, but using typical delaying tactics, of which in many respects they were the masters in both world wars, where small groups of men can hold up pretty substantial groups of the enemy. And if we look at this ground on this map between the dark line of the end of the Battle of the Somme, and we look at that ground from Gommecourt across to Sey-Seyssel near Saint-Pierre-Vaste Wood, which was essentially the British sector. The French troops started just beyond that down towards Peronne, although some British units had been down on the Somme River Valley sector in front of Peronne during this period as well. Then the Germans pulled back, and using all of the villages, some of the farms, some of the wooded areas that had previously been behind their lines, they slow down this Allied advance, whether it's in the area where the British and Empire forces are advancing, or where subsequently the French would advance beyond Peronne, south of the Amiens-Saint-Quentin road towards Saint-Quentin, Saint-Quentin, and so on. So it's a slow withdrawal. And the idea is to kind of bring the enemy towards your domain, and then you've dug a new system of defences, Siegfriedstellung, the Hindenburg Line, and you'll pull into that properly, and the enemy will have no choice but to attack that ground. Now, you haven't dug trenches for him, as we'll discuss. He's got to dig those trenches as well. So it kind of is a bit of a double whammy in terms of the experience of the Allies, because they've now got to advance through unfamiliar ground. It's a virgin territory where nothing has been dug. The enemy have got their defences, but you've just got a field in front of it. So, I've covered the film 1917 extensively on the podcast, both with its own dedicated episode and referenced it many times. It's actually really good at explaining, at visualizing that period of the First World War. So this is the ground they pull across from and back to in terms of the Hindenburg Line. And in terms of how the British then move on to photograph that, we've got a few images taken by various official photographers during this period, starting at Gommecourt. It's an interesting photograph in its own right. It shows some of the old German trenches near to Gommecourt village, probably near to Gommecourt Wood, not the park, I don't think, just simply because of the kind of line of the land here. I think this is almost certainly Gommecourt Wood. And it's interesting for a number of reasons. The Germans have disappeared. Essentially what happened on most of these sectors is one day the British soldiers woke up, looked through their trench periscopes, and old Fritz seemed to have gone. Patrols are sent out, confirm this, and then they tentatively moved into some of these positions. And the Germans had left booby traps here and there, but generally they just abandoned these forward positions to entice the British to begin what they called the advance to the Hindenburg Line, and what they looked at it from a German perspective as the withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line. So it's an interesting image kind of showing the trenches at Gommecourt, how deep they were. Here it is, March 1917, nearly 9 months after the Battle of the Somme, when the 46th and 56th divisions have both attacked these positions, but the German trench system is still in pretty good condition. There's some intriguing bits in this photograph as well, because that's quite an early assault bridge that we can see across the trench there. The Royal Engineers built those increasingly from kind of late 1916, 17 onwards, and would use them in attacks to place bridges over substantial locations that required this, obstacles that required it. Very often for vehicles. Sometimes there were versions that could carry the weight of a tank, for example. So I don't know specifically why that one's there, but it gives us a bit of an insight into that bit of kit. And then the soldier standing on it with that big thing over his shoulder. I'm not entirely sure what that is. It could be a cover for a Vickers machine gun. There could even be a Stokes mortar in there. But it could be, again, additional bits of engineering equipment. But it kind of gives us an insight into, here's a bunch of British soldiers been ordered forward from their old front line into the German positions, and they're kind of looking in there, and the photographers captured that just as they're about to begin their advance across it. But beyond the old battlefield area where the fighting had taken place in 1916, the Germans had looked at all the infrastructure that the British and then the French in their sector would roll up in the process of it, and decided to adopt a scorched earth policy where they would destroy as much of it as possible and use it to create massive obstacles for the British, the Allies, to advance across. And we've got a few images that will give us an example of that. So this is Atti, just outside of Arras, and the Germans have blown a mine at the major road junction there, basically kind of prohibiting the movement of traffic and vehicles and limbers and everything else. You've got to fill that in before you can do anything else. And they use this tactic right across that area from south of Arras to down near Peronne. When you read the accounts of British units going and Australian units going into this area, they encounter this quite a lot. And the Germans often, in the villages they were pulling back through, would use these mine craters as points of defense. So this is not one where I think there was any kind of action, but there were many like this where the Germans would take the buildings around the crater, set up machine gun and rifle teams in there. Whoever would turn up, and there would be a bit of a firefight for the crater. A few casualties would be inflicted. They'd slow the momentum of the advance down, and then the Germans, almost at the blink of an eye, would withdraw to go and fight another day in another place. So mine craters were a big part of it. And these were not ones where they dug as per the kind of static nature of trench warfare and placed a charge underneath. They've probably got some pioneers to come along and basically dig a big hole, put a charge in there, and blow a traditional crater just to create an instant obstacle. The other thing they did was to lop down trees along all the roads, those long straight roads of northern France that we're used to, great for moving traffic. Not so great for moving traffic if they've got chopped down trees across them, because as is happening here, you've then got to use men, material, time, everything else to move these obstacles. It's what these men from a pioneer or an engineer, or even possibly at this stage a labour corps unit, are doing as they're trying to remove those trunks on the road so vehicle traffic can use it again. This is near to Peronne, and that is the marshland of the River Somme on the left-hand side, because Peronne was the kind of pivotal point between the British and the French during this withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line. And for example, 48th South Midland Division came into that area. Charles Carrington writes a lot about that in his book, for example. So this is another obstacle that they used, and they then blew bridges just about everywhere. Wherever there was a bridge, it was blown up. And this is a bridge across one of the Somme canal areas at the village of Chaulnes, which is in the kind of southern Somme sector. And again, you kind of look at this, just going back to 1917. Yes, it's one of my favourite movies. All of this kind of looks like the landscape that we see depicted in different aspects of that film, reflecting, of course, the real history of what happened. This is very different warfare. They were not fighting in trenches. There was no man's land as such. They were advancing over ground that had barely been touched by the war, but the Germans had destroyed, creating these kind of obstacles that occasionally would have to be fought over. The other thing that they encountered as they advanced through this area, and this is near to the village of Hervillers, which is kind of just north of Bapaume. If you were going to go from Bapaume up to Arras today, you'd go through the village of Hervillers on your route. There's a British cemetery there, and as you can see, this is some of the first burials in it of Australian soldiers who were advancing from their positions in the kind of central Somme area around to the northern part of Bapaume and heading out towards the villages in that area, places like Lagnicourt, for example. And they've sustained some casualties in bumping the German forces in that area, and they're burying some of their lads here in an extension to an existing cemetery, which is a Deutsche Soldatenfriedhof, a German soldiers' cemetery. And they encountered quite a lot of these at this time, which, when you read the accounts of men who were there, quite surprised them as to how ornate they were and how men were individually buried, and they had often very quite detailed and quite fancy crosses, as we can see in this picture. And often they contain the graves of what for the Germans were enemy dead, so British and French dead from earlier periods of the conflict or from the Battle of the Somme in 1916, and they noted how those men had been properly buried and honoured and respected. And I think it changed the kind of point of view of quite a few soldiers who encountered this, because this was still a period of war which there was a lot of anti-German propaganda, and there were those newspaper cartoons which showed German soldiers pouring a liquid into a shell. So there's this famous one which reflects the song that they sang at military funerals, I Had a Comrade. And this cartoon called I Had a Comrade shows a typical Hunnish Fritz pouring this liquid into a shell, which is the glycerine for the high explosive for the shell, about to fire it off at the enemy. And when you look at the liquid he's pouring into the shell, it's full of the horrified faces of his comrades who he's melted down to turn into glycerine to put in these high explosive shells. So there was this propaganda idea that the Germans were melting down their dead, basically, and cemeteries like this did not exist. But in the advance to that Hindenburg Line, British and Empire soldiers discovered that cemeteries did exist, and they were really quite extensive, and in many ways reflected their own kind of culture of commemorating the dead, and also showed how the Germans cared for their losses just as much as anyone else. So as much as in the middle of the war, anyone's mind on things are going to be changed, I'm sure if you read Henry Williamson's books, for example, he talks quite a lot about this. It's something that did strike many a soldier who encountered this. But once they were beyond these villages, once they were beyond the ground where the Germans just intended to slow them down, at some point they got to the positions in front of the Hindenburg Line. And this is not an official photograph. This is one from my old frontline archives. In fact, it's from a collection given to me by a veteran who's in this photograph. The chap second from right is Ron Short. Now, he joined up originally as a private in the 1st South Downs Battalion. He was from Eastbourne, one of the very first men to enlist when they formed the battalion in 1914, one of the first 1100. He was wounded at Richbourg, 1916, and he then applied for a commission, which he got, and he was commissioned into the Queen's Regiment, the Queen's Royal West Surreys, and he joined their 2nd Battalion just prior to the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line. He took a camera with him and took about 50 odd photographs, of which this is one. And it's an interesting one because it's the officers of his company that he's in. The picture he got his batman to take the photograph for them, but as much as the foreground showing the kind of dress that officers were wearing in the battlefield in the front line area, which is a mix of officers' uniforms and ordinary British soldiers' kit to break up their identity, to kind of disguise the fact that they were officers. It also, for me, one of the most interesting bits is actually the background of this photograph, the skyline there, where the men in the Second Queens are digging in. And this is basically what these men were faced with the Germans having pulled back to the Hindenburg Line, and they're dug in these fancy new positions with thick belts of wire, deep trenches, machine gun bunkers, trench mortar pits, all this kind of stuff. You now have got to dig a line as you've advanced towards it, and your only alternative is to do that often in broad daylight in places where there's very little cover. And in some locations, they had to pull back slightly and find an area where, like this, they could stand upright and dig in without the Germans absolutely annihilating them. And this is very close to the village of Ekust, which is a village that, again, features, I don't have shares in the film 1917, but it features in that story. So this is literally kind of a real image of what took place in that film. It's almost as if Sam Menzies kind of saw these pictures before he made it, but that wasn't the case. Anyway, I think this kind of really gives us a bit of an idea as to what British soldiers faced at that period. And once that line was created and joined up over the course of the next few days and weeks, and in the month between the withdrawal, well, not even a month in some cases, it's only a matter of weeks between the withdrawal and the arrival at locations where new trenches were dug and what then became the beginning of the Battle of Arras, that's when this new line was dug. And it wasn't very fancy. The trenches were shallow, basic, because someone up in the higher echelons of command was already planning an offensive, and you didn't need to create detailed and in-depth positions when you were going to be advancing soon anyway, and advancing through that new German line and bringing the war to an end. So they were pretty basic trenches compared to what they'd experienced previously, but that was kind of the intention. But it's the line that was then essentially formed in preparation for the battle that was about to come. And that battle would become, again, with the Battle Nomenclature Committee, it would eventually be called the Battle of Arras. At the time, it was broken up into battles of the Scarpe, for example. The British often like to name battles after rivers, and the River Scarpe runs through the main Arras battlefield. It's an interesting battle, and we're only going to focus on the first day of it, 9th of April 1917. There were 3 army sectors, which this was, at this point of the war, was quite unusual to have men from 3 separate armies, so with 3 separate commanders. 3rd Army Sector was Sir Henry Horne, they were in the north. Sorry, that's 1st Army Sector, Sir Henry Horne in the north. 3rd Army Sector was General Sir Edmund Allenby, who was in the middle, the bulk of the troops that made the attack on the 9th of April. And then to the south, in the 5th Army Sector, that was General Sir Hubert Gough. And that's where, for example, on the 9th of April, they didn't attack. You had the 62nd West Riding Division and also some of the Australian formations down there as well. 0 hour for the 9th of April 1917 was at 5:30 in the morning. I mean, it's the spring. In fact, the winter really wasn't even over at this stage. And it's a time where there's enough light for the men to see to a certain degree to move forward, but enough darkness to shield your advance. And again, this is kind of an outcome of the Battle of the Somme. Although we can watch Blackadder and many others and believe that the British fought the same kind of battles again and again, they didn't, they learned. Advancing in broad daylight is never a good idea unless you have to, and battles increasingly took place in some degree of darkness. The weather was really poor. It was a very, very cold winter. The winter of 1916-17 said to be the coldest winter of the war. On the Somme front, there were temperatures of -20 recorded at some points, for example. While it wasn't quite as cold as that in April 1917, it was still very cold, and there was snow. Some areas were completely covered in snow, and in some sectors there were snow blizzards when the men attacked, famously in the Canadian part of the northern part of the advance near Vimy, but in other parts of the line as well. And the frontage that was attacked on the 9th of April 1917 was about 12 miles wide. We're going to look at a map of it in a minute. That's 22 kilometers approximately. And there was, in theory, about 200,000 or so men in that area. Now, not all of those were in the first wave of the attack, but it just shows the concentration of troops. And it was a real kind of reflection of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF at that time, in that it didn't just include British divisions. You had a very wide mix of different types of British units, from regulars to New Army to territorials. You had the Canadian Corps to the north, who were part of the First Army sector. They were going to be the kind of northern flank of the advance. And you had the Australians down near Bullecourt, but you also had New Zealanders who provided a lot of the engineering for the battle. It prepared a whole system of subways, joined up all the chalk caves under Arras to create this ability to move up underground on the eve of the battle, unseen by the enemy, protected in this cave system, and then come up very close to your jump off point and then make your advance from there. And if any of you have been to the Wellington quarries at Arras, you will have seen this, which is a section of that underground city, really, that the New Zealand engineers and New Zealand tunnellers made, that is there preserved for all time for people to visit. And it's something we haven't yet really covered, I don't think, on the old front line. And yep, that's another podcast promise there. But in terms of casualties, I mean, in if you think that on the first day of the Somme, probably about 110 to 120,000 men were ready to go into action on the 1st of July. And again, not all of those were necessarily committed. And there was 57,000 casualties, of which 19,000 were killed, close on 20,000 really. On the first day of the Battle of Arras, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database, when you put that date in and you specifically ask for commemorations that are in France, which narrows it down to that Arras area, you're looking at just over 6,800 dead for the 9th of April 1917. And that's not nothing. That's 6,800, nearly 6,900 lives. But it's nowhere near the kind of scale of casualties for the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And generally, the first day advance was successful in most areas, not always successful. Not every objective was captured. But what you see, I think, in terms of the tactics side of it, is that lessons learned from the Somme are applied. And this new German system of defences, which they see as impregnable, proves not to be impregnable at all if you have the right approach of the combination of artillery, tanks, aircraft, and infantry on the ground. And that is still a work in process. It's something that will not really be truly refined. That nature of orchestration of battle, where you approach the battlefield like the conductor of an orchestra, and you want to make sure all of the elements of your orchestra are functioning and performing correctly, that doesn't take place until 1918. It's not, despite many nations' belief, it is not the invention of one man. It is part of this long period of learning and the dissemination of knowledge through training pamphlets, and also the increasing investment by the whole BEF, which includes all of the Empire forces, in training behind the lines and applying those lessons. So it's all part of that. But one of the great, I guess, enigmas of the First World War is that we do see a clear kind of line of learning and a path of learning and a progression in the way that battles are fought, but always at this terrible, terrible cost. So in terms of the actual kind of battlefield itself, this is a map from the official history that kind of shows it quite neatly. Up in the northern part of the battlefield, so we're in the 1st Army sector there, we've got 4 Canadian divisions in the Canadian Corps, which are assisted by 2 British divisions. Not always realised that there were 2 British divisions there. The 5th provided men as a kind of backup, as a reinforcement for Canadian troops in the main assault on the ridge, and the 24th Division were on the flanks, and they were attacking the ground just north of the Pimple and wouldn't really go into the assault until the 4th Canadian Division had actually taken the Pimple on several days into the battle. But the Canadians are up there. It's Byng's last command as Corps commander, and just prior to Arthur Currie taking over. Currie's still a divisional commander at this stage. But what you see within the Canadian Corps is the dissemination of information, and war not being fought by committee, but commanders like Currie talking to his senior commander Byng and dictating, explaining, whatever we're going to call it, what is necessary. So I think, Canada likes to think that this was a battle that changed the world and changed the way the war was fought. But in many respects, if we examined all the other corps that went into action on the 9th of April 1917, we would find something very, very similar, with corps commanders whose names we don't always recognise, because Byng of Vimy and Arthur Currie, who would go on to command the Canadian Corps after this battle in his first action at Hill 70 and then at Passchendaele, those names are perhaps better known. But it reflects the kind of changing nature of warfare, really, and how the BEF fought it. And of course, the wider formation of BEF, British Expeditionary Force, is the important bit here, because these units do not exist in isolation. And the Canadian Corps attack at Vimy is not a separate battle to the Battle of Arras. It's all part of it. And then in the 3rd Army area, we've got a big mix of British units. So we're in Allenby's sector here, from famous units like the 51st Highland Division, who are advancing on the flanks of the Canadians. It's quite a Scottish battle. So apart from the Jocks in the 51st, you've also got the 9th Scottish Division and the 15th Scottish Division, who are part of the 1st and 2nd 100,000 of New Army volunteers. Obviously, by April 1917, there are few men from Kitchener's army in 1914 still there, but nevertheless, the ones that are there are often now platoon commanders, company commanders, and in some cases, battalion commanders. And the 9th Scottish Division, which, following its losses at Lewes, had absorbed new recruits, disbanded one of its brigades, replaced that with the South African Brigade, and Brigadier General Lukin, who had commanded them at Delville Wood, had now taken over command of the division, and this would be his first major advance as the divisional commander. And I think we did a podcast on that, and it was perhaps one of their finest hours, leading to them eventually placing a divisional memorial there. And if we look at the kind of other divisions were there, a mix of territorial and New Army, and one regular division, the 3rd Division, which had been fighting as a division since the very beginning of the war in August 1914. But in many respects, these kind of the nomenclature of what type of unit they were wasn't always relevant now, because this is April 1917, nearly a year into conscription, and in most battalions in these divisions, the vast number of men who were serving in the ranks were conscripts that had been trained up in the winter of 1916-17 and then sent over as reinforcements to replace losses on the Somme the previous year. And then to the south, that's where you've got Gough's positions to the south, where the Australians and the 62nd West Riding Division were, but they did not attack. They were not scheduled to attack on the 9th of April. That would be something that would follow up following the successes to the north, and their main attack would go in a couple of days later. And in many respects, that's a subject for another talk. But this gives us a bit of an idea of the main kind of battle area, from Vimy Ridge in the north through to the ground northeast, east and southeast of the city of Arras, which is rolling chalk downland down towards the southern part of the Hindenburg Line, in those famous areas like Bullecourt and Quasi, which again also features in the film 1917. So just like we've done, and I think not everyone will have seen the previous two talks, so like we've done in the previous talks is what I did for this, and this is, I think, is the value of having these online sources now, is to go onto the Imperial War Museum photographic website, where you can go onto their catalogue, essentially. You can select photographs, and then you can put in a search term. And if you put in a date, it needs to kind of go backwards. So 1917, 0409 for the 9th of April 1917, and then it comes up with the respective images. And it's a really, really interesting way to kind of see how different elements of the war were photographed and recorded, and of course who did it, because when you look at each image, it gives you the kind of crib notes for the image and the caption and the original negative number, but it also tells you who the photographer was, which is an important element of it, because they all had their different style. We've kind of spoken about this before with people like Ernest Brooks, for example, and we're going to see some of the kind of familiar characters in this one as well. Now, I normally start with some air photographs, and what was quite interesting is there weren't that many taken, or certainly not that many that are catalogued on the Imperial War Museum website, that were actually taken on the 9th of April 1917. And this is not a particularly good one, and it shows the road system near to the village of Petit Vimy, which is just on the other side of Vimy Ridge. It's in the join between 2nd and 3rd Canadian Division advances on that day. And it's a typical kind of image of the ground as it was. We always think of First World War battlefields as these chewed up landscapes of moonscapes of craters and so on. But of course, there'd not been any serious fighting in any of these areas, particularly beyond places like Vimy Ridge. So the ground was still in fairly good condition, but we can see that the artillery has already begun to do its job here. And if you look at the original images, lots of kind of pinpricks where shells have gone off and there were craters there. We can see the chalk spoil from trenches and also the damage. And there's some cloud coverage going on there in the southern part of the image. Then that kind of obscures what's there. But it doesn't seem, unlike some of the other battles that we've looked at, that necessarily the RFC were up there taking tons of photographs. But of course, this is April 1917. We've just had our Royal Flying Corps RAF series on the podcast. And what happened in April 1917? Well, that was bloody April, where the Germans had got the upper hand in aircraft technology, and they were shooting RFC planes out of the sky on a regular basis. It wasn't quite, as we see in Blackadder, the 20 minuters, but nevertheless the casualties were high, and ones that were always vulnerable to the Germans were the slow-moving, deliberately slow-moving aircraft, where the observer was hanging out the side with a camera taking photographs like this one. So maybe that is part of the reason why there aren't as many aerial images. But on the ground, the key photographer that concerns us for this talk is the chap that we encountered in the Battle of the Ancre. When we looked at the photographs for that, is John Warwick Brooke. Not to be confused with Ernest Brooks. John Warwick Brooke was a different character, an interesting character who had combat experience. He'd served with the King Edward's Horse in the early period of the war, been awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for bravery, and then because of his interest and knowledge and ability as a photographer, been given a position where he could become one of those who would take the official record. And that image on the right, which is taken in the Arras sector in March of 1917, shows a fighting patrol trench raid of men of the Cameronian Scottish Rifles going out of a forward sap to raid the German lines. And of course, there's the image that I use for the Old Front Line podcast. So he's obviously a photographer that's really important, certainly to me, and I think is important to the record, the permanent record of the First World War. And he was a very skilled photographer in the work that he did. So all of these images, pretty much, until we get to the Canadian sector, are his. Now, he started before the battle had even begun. He got up into the line to go and take some images. I think he was, because of his combat experience, was not afraid to do that. And this is an interesting image. It's on the 8th of April, so the day before the battle, and it shows some forward observers. It shows a FOO team, forward observation officer team, at Cuthbert Crater. And that was northeast of Arras. And actually was in, I think, the join between 9th Scottish, 15th Scottish, that kind of area. So I'm not quite sure what gunner officers from the 12th Eastern Division were doing there, because they were a little bit further south, but it could be they'd loaned some of their artillery for that part of the bombardment. But it shows a typical forward observation team. So on the right, we've got two officers there, one with a pair of binoculars, who's looking out across, presumably that's the lip of the crater, looking out towards the German lines, watching the fall of shot of their field guns, because these men would be part of a field artillery brigade from the division, so they'd have 18 pounders. And then the other guy, which looks like he's holding up a stick, that's actually a trench periscope, and he's looking through that because he doesn't fancy sticking his head, I suspect, over the top of that crater and having a good look. But he's using this trench periscope to have a look at the German lines, perhaps a little bit beyond the front line position itself. It's giving him an elevated view beyond their wire, beyond their front line, to something that they're particularly targeting. And on the left, two gunners, other ranks, not officers, who are part of the signalling team, and they're on the blower relaying the officers' instructions back to the guns so they can correct the fall of shot. And it's a static telephone system, so you can see wires coming out all over the place, one straight towards the camera, for example. And this is typical of the whole battlefield. I mean, this crisscross of wire everywhere that was part of the communication system was both how it functioned and also created problems for men on the ground. And they could be talking to people who were several thousand yards away, but joined up through this static system of telephone line. And that, of course, meant that the line could be broken at any point and had to be repaired, which is why you had signallers there, linesmen to go out and repair that line, get the telephone functioning again. It's what restricted their ability to do this job properly. With the lack of radio communications, which would not come until a generation later, then this kind of work was done by these kind of static means of communication. And if all that failed, it was too far away to send runners, so you'd have to send men up onto a rise somewhere with flags to signal back to a relay point, or use a Lucas lamp to use Morse to beam a message back to a relay point and then relay it to the guns. So you can see why signallers, and you look at the exposed position of this, you can see why signallers' life expectancy wasn't particularly good. He then moved on to kind of have a look at some of the trenches, and I wish he'd have taken a few more images in these assembly trenches that they'd constructed. And you can see here the work that's being done, getting ready for the offensive the next day. They're building scaling ladders. Some of these trenches dated back to the very beginning of when trenches were dug here. So many of them were French from 1914-15. Not always the best trenches, sometimes perhaps deeper than some of the British trenches would always be. So there was a necessity to have these kind of scaling ladders. And they were built extensively, being constructed here by the Royal Engineers on different parts of the line to enable men to get up out of the trenches and get into no man's land and begin the attack. And we've seen, no doubt, many films and perhaps read many works of fiction in which we know men go up those ladders and the Germans are sweeping the top of the parapet with machine guns and bodies start falling back down. Of course, that did happen in the Great War. We don't have to go very far to find that, but it didn't really happen at Arras because the bombardment was pinning the Germans down into their positions to stop them from doing that. So by the time these men were up these ladders, out into no man's land, beginning their advance, the last of the shells were falling on the German positions, enabling them to catch up with that bombardment, get into those German positions and overrun those areas very, very quickly. That was the idea. It didn't always happen, but it did happen a lot more than it had happened the previous year. So this is all part of the preparations. And on the right-hand side of the trench there, those spheres with the sticks sticking out of them are 2-inch toffee apple or plum pudding bombs that were fired from a 2-inch mortar. And they are obviously stockpiling for the mortar teams to come up and do their final bit of bombardment. Often those things were used to try and cut difficult bits of German wire. Although when you read some of the accounts, it kind of went over, blew up underneath the wire, tossed it in the air, tangled it up, and then threw it back down again, which wasn't no good to man or beast. So that's what he took on the 8th of April, and I can't find any more pictures that he took that day. Maybe his movements were restricted. When the battle began, it's 5:30 in the morning, and he hasn't got the ability to take photographs at that time of day, and I suspect he may well have been held back. So he appears to have moved up once the initial assault has gone in and the advance is continuing. So I think he's come up kind of mid to late morning to take this next series of photographs. And he's come up from the center of Arras somewhere. And this road that these men are marching up is the Arras to Cambrai road, going kind of due east, essentially, from the city of Arras. So this is on the outskirts of the city itself, facing towards where the initial front lines had been. And this is in the sector where the 3rd Division had attacked and one side of the road, 12th Eastern Division had attacked the other, and then elements of the 37th Division moved up to continue with the advance. And that's what we're seeing here. So these men are from the 10th Raw Fusiliers, shows a column of them moving up. One thing that you'll see in all of these photographs is that every single man now has a bag on his chest, which his gas mask is in that. And this is the new type of gas mask, the small box respirator, the SBR, which came in at the end of 1916 to replace the hooded style gas mask, PH helmet. And it was a much more effective gas mask and would remain in use until the end of the war. And what these photographs show us is that by this stage, these units pretty much all had that type of gas mask, and it was now commonplace. And that they're kind of wearing, some of them have got leather jerkins on, they've got their rain capes out, and we can kind of get a bit of a sense that the weather isn't the best, which is what we know from that battle. And then he moves to the front of the column and he takes another shot looking back down across the same group of men. And it's an interesting battalion, the 10th Battalion Royal Fusiliers, one that's interested me for a long time, because this is again from the old frontline archives. It's from a collection of images that I have of the 10th Royal Fusiliers. They were the Stockbrokers battalion, all of the original men who joined, all of these men in this photograph, apart from the officers, because they didn't have numbers, they had numbers that began STK, indicating that they were part of that Stockbrokers battalion. They trained at Colchester, where this image is taken, and then they went across to the Western Front in 1915. On the Somme, 1916, they suffered heavy losses. So most of the men that we see in this photograph would have been killed or wounded, possibly taken prisoner, but certainly they would have become casualties in 1916. And no doubt some of them still survived by the time of the Battle of Arras, but they kind of, their battalion, the men we've seen in that photograph, probably the previous photographs probably reflect, as I've said before, the changing nature of the British Army in going from a volunteer force, which these men in this image are part of, to an army made up largely of conscripts. And then he stays in the same area, and presumably the 10th Fusiliers moved off. They would then go on to take part in the initial assaults on Monchy-le-Preux and Orange Hill, the ground kind of guarding the way to Monchy-le-Preux. And then jumping on many, many years, I went up to an archaeological dig close to Orange Hill in the 90s, where a burial site of men from the Royal Fusiliers was found by Alain Jacques, one of the archaeologists, French archaeologists who worked in that area. So, I mean, who knows, some of the lads who were in those photographs could well have been those guys killed up there whose remains were found all those years later, and they're now buried in the back of Monchy British Cemetery. But these men are not infantry soldiers. They're engineers by the look of it. They're taking building materials up, with a couple of officers overseeing it, going off to do some specialist kit and some specialist task, rather, somewhere up on the battlefield. But he doesn't then seem to have lingered there that long. Possibly shell fire, long-distance artillery fire from the Germans began to drop as they reacted to the continued British advance, and then he moves off. And I put this map in there because it shows this ground. So that's the long straight road of the Arras to Cambrai road, and the pictures that we've just seen are in this Faubourg Saint-Sauveur, which today is kind of it's a kind of suburb of Arras. It's part of the kind of inner ring road. There's a big roundabout not far from where it says Faubourg Saint-Sauveur on this map. and that's the road that takes you up onto the main Arras battlefields, and there's another kind of ring road that takes you down to the Somme or up towards the next bit of the Hindenburg line. And the previous images were taken in the Faubourg, the outskirts of Arras, and the next lot are taken in the trench system that we can see to the south, leading up towards the village of Tilloy-les-Mofflaines, which was the initial objective of the attacking troops in this area on the morning of the 9th of April 1917. And it's one of those things that once, if you know a little bit about the landscape, if you study these images, you can begin to kind of tie them down to maps like this and work out where they kind of are, where they exist, if you like, on the landscape of the past through the maps. And then this is from the WFA's excellent trench mapper system. And then you can use a little slider to then transfer this into the kind of modern Google overlay, and then you can relay those images to the landscape of today, the present, and kind of figure out where they were, which I think is a good way of understanding and interpreting the landscape itself. And these images are all pretty similar. They show the kind of British advance at this stage of the Battle of Arras, with troops, again, almost certainly from the 37th Division, passing over men who've already captured that ground, because Arras was a battle of leapfrogging, where one unit wasn't required to take all of the objectives. It was a battle where one unit would capture one bit of ground, another one pass through them, another one pass through them, and that then continued not just within battalions, within brigades, and brigades within divisions. It would continue division to division as well. So Tilloy is captured, the approaches to Monchy are captured, and now they're sending up more troops to continue with the advance. And there's nothing on these images to really identify these men in terms of unit flashes, divisional flashes, stuff painted on the helmets. I don't know whether they kind of had a bit of a kind of security scare before Arras, but they seem to have removed a lot of identifying artifacts and objects from soldiers, including their dog tags, for this battle, which is one of the reasons I suspect it's got such a high volume of missing soldiers. So he positioned himself in different ways to give different kind of views in terms of the direction of the advance. And it shows this is the battlefield which had just been captured that morning. So I suspect this is probably midday-ish, something like that. And already it's safe enough for fairly close groups of men to advance in broad daylight in the open. So it kind of shows how rapid this advance was. I mean, in some parts of the Arras battlefield, they advanced 3.5 miles on the 9th of April 1917, which was unprecedented in terms of trench warfare and the British experience of trench warfare. And again, kind of remembering that map and the dead straight road and the long line of houses, then if we look at the background, I've just kind of zoomed in on this image, we can see there's a whole load of rooftops in fairly good condition buildings here, despite the fact that Arras has sat on the front line for so long. A lot of its buildings are still intact, and that kind of helps us place this. That's the Arras to Cambrai Road in the background, and then the buildings of that Faubourg Saint-Sever coming out of the city itself, where he'd been taking those earlier pictures. So, but we're on the actual kind of battlefield area, and then he takes another series of pictures like this in what it says is the advance from their assembly trenches during the opening day of the Battle of Arras. I suspect these may well have been assembly trenches that were dug for the initial waves. They're now being reused. This is close to, I think, where the British front line was, because in the background there, and again, I've zoomed in on this, we can see quite clear, quite substantial buildings, but to the right, the kind of matchstick wood, the trunks of a wooded area, which I think places this the village of Tilloy. So where, again, we're not seeing an advance into the capture of Tilloy, because that's already been taken by units of the 3rd Division, including the Suffolk Regiment on the morning of the 9th of April. But these are almost certainly men from the next wave. They could be 37th Division moving up towards Monchy, but this is on a kind of a join with the next division, 14th Light Division, and these could be men moving up towards the next bit of the battlefield in that sector as they moved up towards places like Wancourt, for example. But nevertheless, it kind of gives us an idea of what the landscape of April 1917 was like. Not a moonscape, not thick with mud, actually fairly good condition. And despite the cold weather and everything else, and the fact that Arras, as I've said, has been on the front line for so many years, there's a lot of intact buildings here, which is something we don't kind of always appreciate. And then he's taken a series of images. I suspect many of these are kind of semi-staged because a lot of those soldiers don't have weapons in their hands. He's just got them to kind of fill into a trench. He's got the movement of what is happening anyway in the background. We can see men with fixed bayonets moving up with those rifles slung. And there's a stretcher party going off up towards the battlefield area, stretcher bearer section. And we've got the buildings in the background then, which again, I'm pretty sure are the outskirts of the city of Arras. And what is always good as a photographer, you know, if they're not going to show continuous images of Tommies advancing, what they are going to show are images of Germans who have surrendered. And if you look at any of these battles of the First World War, the imagery is populated with photographs of German prisoners. And these show Germans coming back from that fighting between Tilloy and the high ground of Feuchy and up towards Monchy and that kind of area as well. Many of them with greatcoats, none of them with Pickelhaubers. They've got Stahlhelms now. This was a period of the war in which pretty much every German soldier has now been issued with a Stahlhelm. And the ones that have lost their Stahlhelms, had their Stahlhelms taken off of them, they've got Feldmutzers, field caps, and they're being moved back. And it's impossible to tell what unit these Germans are from, but they look infantry rather than artillery or supporting troops. So they've obviously been captured in the recent fighting for this ground, including a machine gun team. And this is, I think, he's gone back to the area just on the outskirts of the city of Arras, and he's taken a couple of shots of this captured German machine gun team with their weapon, with the actual MG08 on its sledge, on its mount, being brought back, no doubt, as a trophy for whichever regiment or battalion has captured this thing. And you don't have to go very far in regimental museums in Britain to see these things on display. And once upon a time, a lot of them were also placed in front of war memorials. But it's an interesting photograph because at first I thought they were coming out of something in the ground on the right-hand side, because the guy is at the back of the sledge and he's got the bulk of the weight in his hands, is much lower than the bloke in front. But I think it's the end of a trench. It's part of a communication trench, perhaps running parallel to the road, and they're just coming up the steps of it and coming up out. And what it shows, I mean, there's another number of, we'll kind of forget the machine gunners for a minute, we'll come back to them in the next image, but we can see casualties being evacuated in the background. So there's quite a lot of stretcher bearers here. These men don't appear to be regimental stretcher bearers, but they do appear to be Royal Army Medical Corps ones from a field ambulance. The guy on the right who's holding up the telephone wire, on the original image, you can just make out a painted RAMC badge on his helmet there. He's got the small box respirator on his chest. For good measure, he's still got his PH gas mask. A lot of soldiers kept both, just in case the one on the chest got struck by shrapnel or bullets and was damaged. They had the backup of their old gas mask as well. He's got two big filled dressing bags round his neck there, which you can get at pretty quickly. So, and he's also got the loop harness for slotting the stretcher handles into as well, which is quite an interesting feature. And we can see another soldier just to the left of the forward German who's got his PH bag bouncing on his backside there as he's taking the stretcher away. So we're still in that transition period between the issue of the small box respirator and the previous gas masks, the PH helmet, but a lot of men are keeping both. It means they've got extra kit. I suspect technically they weren't meant to do that, but soldiers, are soldiers. They're not always going to follow the lesser of every law that's laid in front of them. And this is the same machine gun team. They've now come out of whatever it is they were coming out of, whether it's a trench or whatever, and they're taking the machine gun back for a trophy somewhere, being escorted away by a sergeant there with his bayonets fixed, and some of the other lads kind of watching as they went. Now, I had a question for the Q&A come through about Germans being chained to machine guns, and it is one of those great myths of the First World War. You'll read plenty of accounts of it, but the sledge, as it was often referred to, that the gun, the mount that machine gun is on, it had straps so it could be pulled away, and a lot of Germans had them. There was a big strapman across their chest with a big buckle, and it clipped into part of the sledge so that two men could clip themselves to it and in action drag it away very, very quickly. And I think what happened was, in some cases, often the gunners would pre-clip themselves to the sledge so they could not have to do that in the midst of battle, but in the process of firing their machine gun, get killed and they're lying dead over their gun, and the strap and the buckle makes it look like someone has strapped them, buckled them, chained them to the machine gun. I'm sure that's the kind of explanation. But these guys, smiling as much as prisoners ever do, carrying their weapon, but being led off to safety in the rear. And then not far away, he finds some German soldiers with their wounded and also assisting the British stretcher bearers in evacuating their wounded as well. And you can see again, every soldier, not a Pickelhaube in sight, no war souvenirs for the British Tommies in this one with Pickelhaubes, each Stahlhelms, and they're much more kind of functional thing. But of course, for the Germans, would become this great potent symbol of veterans of the First World War and German militarism, really, in that early part of the 20th century. Warwick Brook then moves over to Feuchy, which is Feuchy, as the British soldiers called it, which is over towards the Scarpe Valley. And he got up into a high building, possibly the remains of the church, and took this shot looking across the rooftops, which again shows us the kind of condition that some of these villages that were captured in the early stage of the Battle of Arras look like. Not smashed to bits, not big piles of rubble, actually structures pretty much intact, possibly very different to what we think of when we think of a First World War battlefield. And again, tying this into the trench maps, there is the position, there's the village of Feuchy there. There's a position in the middle of the map called Spider Corner, which is where the road goes under the railway line. There's a kind of little bridge there. And it goes into a long valley called Battery Valley, where the Germans had their field guns and where the Essex Regiment, I think it was the 9th Essex, captured those guns at the point of the bayonet on the 9th of April 1917, on the first day of the Battle of Arras, which ties nicely into some of the pictures we're about to see. Before we get there, he managed to find a limber in this area, limbering up a British field gun unit, limbering up one of their guns to move on, because the advance has been so rapid and so far, the infantry have now outstripped their field artillery, and the guns have got to move up to new gun positions, dig in there and be able to provide fire support in case the Germans counterattack or for the advance to continue. So it was a very busy day for all artillery units, because artillery was such an important part of any battle now. And for the field gunners, who were much nearer to the point of battle, for them it was necessary to move frequently on this day by limbering up their guns, getting them up. And we can see we had again a question on the Q&A episodes recently about drivers in the Royal Field Artillery, and we can see several drivers. I don't know, zoom in on it. Several drivers sitting on their horses there, and the main driver's about to get onto the limber. Men behind securing the backs of the limber that contain the ammunition. There's two lockers there with the shells inside. And then some of the other gunners are about to lift up the tail of the field gun and attach that to the limber, so the driving team can move off and get the gun to wherever it is required. And I was listening to the reunion on Radio 4 this morning, which is about Warhorse, Michael Morpurgo's Warhorse. And it's a very good episode, which I thoroughly recommend, incidentally. It's not, again, it's not like Blackadder. It's not a documentary, Warhorse, but it shines a light on an aspect of the First World War, which you can see very vividly in images like this, because the losses in horses, and particularly in the Battle of Arras, where cavalry was actually employed at Monchy later on in the battle, the losses in horses were quite substantial. So whether this is at Battery Valley, which we mentioned before, where the German field guns were captured by the Essex, I don't know. It's close to Feuchy, and it shows, intriguingly, gunners of the Royal Marine Artillery at a captured German 105. Now, that's a howitzer. It's not a field gun, part of the German artillery that was used at divisional level. What the Royal Marine Artillery are doing now, I don't know. I mean, they had 15-inch guns, and they were right over on the other side of Arras, firing at probably almost at their extremity for this battle. Whether these are from a Royal Marine Artillery forward observation team, I don't know, but certainly they're unusual men to see this far forward on a battlefield. And I think it's one of the few occasions in which men from this unit are photographed on a battlefield while the battle is still going on, because generally they're doing their gunner-related duties, spotting for the guns, working on the guns, which are much further back, and they're not really getting into positions where this kind of photograph can be taken. And I don't think it's the same gun, but this is perhaps in another part of Feuchy. They've gone and they've kind of set up what they imagine a German gun team to do with a piece of kit like this. And there they are holding the shell, and one of them's got the cordite charge in the case, and they're kind of making look as if they're putting this gun into action. It's a very staged image, but nevertheless, in the background, we can see the village and see what kind of condition that's in as well. So it's an interesting image, and close to that location, as I say, at Battery Valley, where guns were taken at the point of the bayonet by the Essex Regiment at the beginning of the battle. Now, I mentioned that Arras kind of demonstrated how essentially combined arms began to come together. I mean, it was far, far from perfect. And part of combined arms, as the Great War moves on, is tanks. And this is a map from one of the Tank Corps reports showing the areas of the use of tanks in the early stage of the Battle of Arras in April 1917. So you can see that kind of big blob just east of Arras, and then some smaller ones for the later fighting up on the Scarpe and around Monchy and down towards Wancourt and Saint Martin and Henin and all these kind of places directly in front of the Hindenburg Line there. But the larger kind of marking of that shows 48 tanks, and that's absolutely correct. There were 48 tanks allocated to Allenby's army in this area to be attached to different units. Unfortunately, not all of them arrived. About half of them went into action. Quite a substantial number ditched, got stuck, were immobilized, and the kind of tanks that they had in the lead up to the battle, they'd been promised Mark IV tanks. These were the new tanks that were coming along. In the end, Mark IVs weren't issued until quite some time into the Battle of Arras, and I'm not sure that any of them were actually used in any of the kind of later battles on the 3rd of May or 1917 or anything like that. I don't think they would be used in action until the third battle of, well, until Messines rather, in June, and then the third Battle of Ypres in July of 1917. So the tanks that they had, of those 48 tanks, I think about a third of them were Mark I's, so they were the very first kind of tanks that were issued, and then the rest were Mark II's. Now they were training tanks, really. They've been kind of fitted up for training men from the tank units, and there'd been an attempt to improve the boilerplate on these tanks because they weren't properly armored, and they were sent to France with the instruction that they now were impervious to armor-piercing bullets. The Battle of Arras proved that that wasn't really the case, and that these tanks really were not, this type of tank were not really fit for combat on the ground. They would need to use the new tanks that were coming along, and we can see some variations in this. So this is very similar to the very first tanks that were used at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in September 1916. There's no road wheel, there's no wheels on the back of the tank to help with the steering, because they found that just got tangled up in wire and all kinds of other obstacles. There's the spuds, these kind of extra track plates on the track to help with the movement in mud. It's got a similar sponson to the early ones. This is a female tank, so it's got machine guns in it. The Mark I females had Vickers guns in, and they replaced those with Lewis guns, which we can see one of the Lewis guns sticking forward of this sponson as this tank moves forward. It says it's from number 3 company. I think it's actually from C battalion, so 3rd battalion. And they had a number of tanks in that kind of central area of the Battle of Arras, but it gives us a bit of an insight. They've also removed the anti-grenade cages from the top of the tank, and you can see that they've got beams, wooden beams on the top there, which again is kind of something they learned from the Somme. To unditch a tank that then gets stuck, you need to have wooden beams to get it out, and so tanks increasingly are fitted with these to help them get out of the muck and the mud and the slime and everything else that they encounter on the battlefield itself. Unfortunately, Warwick Brook didn't take too many pictures of tanks. He took this one, and then he took this very famous one that appears in many, many anthologies of Great War images and in every book on the Battle of Arras. And it shows men from the probably the 4th Division moving up in the Scarpe Valley near to Fampoux. We can see cratered ground in the background and the tank itself. And this tank is a mail tank. It's got a 6-pounder. It's got the early 6-pounders with quite long barrels. So again, it's got the spuds on it, the extra track plates to help it move across the ground. It's got petrol tins on the roof. I'm hoping they didn't contain petrol because that would have caused one or two issues. Perhaps it was being used to take up some materials as well. I mean, who knows? But it's got itself ditched in the side of the road there, and it looks pretty heftily stuck. And this was 50% of the tanks that went into action on the 9th of April. This is what happened to them. So it wasn't the finest hour for British tanks in this phase of the First World War. But again, it was indicative of how tanks were becoming such an important weapon that would be employed on the battlefield itself. And in cases that just down the road from here, there was a position in which 3 sets of tracks came into one part of the railway system that ran from Arras to Lens, and it created a kind of a triangle. It's called the railway triangle, and a tank was very heavily involved in taking out the German positions there alongside the infantry from one of the Scottish divisions. So they did have a role to play, but their real role wouldn't come until much later on in this year. This was the kind of the last of the harking back to the original tanks. So we've moved out of Warwick Brooks area, we've moved out of the British area, and that is about the extent of the images for the British sector. It's not very extensive, the imagery recorded for the 9th of April, which is quite surprising considering it was the next big battle after the Battle of the Somme. And the next area that's covered from a photographic point of view is to the north, that very northern part of the Battle of Arras in the Canadian Corps sector. And this is an image that I've used many times. It comes from an album that I have that I acquired many, many years ago. It's quite a big album, and it's Canadian battle photographs from an exhibition that they held in London. And you could buy this album. I mean, I don't know how many were produced. I suspect not many, because I've never ever seen another one of them, in which they took the original negatives and did new special prints from the negatives and then put them in this album. And this is the kind of thing that that they had. So they're quite big printed images, slightly bigger than the negative itself, very, very high resolution, tinted slightly. And I'm not saying photoshopped in one or two places, but there is bits of it where you kind of think, have they overlaid a sky or bombardments onto some of the images? I don't think this is one of them, but there are one or two that are like that. This shows they're all Canadian images. They're all taken in the Battle of Vimy Ridge or associated with the Battle of Vimy Ridge. There's this one, for example, which is not on the 9th of April. It's a couple of days later when the Canadians have got to the crest of Hill 145, and they're now looking over the top of the ridge. This is not far really from where the Vimy Memorial is today. They're looking down into Vimy, and they're looking down beyond into the Douai Plain. And this is the view that the Canadians got once that crest of Vimy was taken. So this kind of imagery is in there. But this is one of them. It's a composite image of a number of photographs that's at the end of this thing. And it was apparently part of the exhibition. And it was to give the British public, or whoever went to see this exhibition, an insight into the faces of the enemy, the faces of the Hun. And I mean, you know, it's almost like a kind of cartoon caricature of Germans. But these are men who fought the Canadians on Vimy Ridge or on the Pimple or wherever else it is. It's been a tough battle, and they're determined troops. And I think you can see the effect and the outcome of battle in many of their faces. And their headgear is fascinating. I mean, we've got Germans there with Stahlhelms on, of course. We've got one who's got a big nick in his Stahlhelm, but that doesn't seem to have had much effect on him. We've got one of them wearing a service dress British cap, instead of any kind of German headgear, whether he's been given that by the photographer or what, or whether he's been given it out of pity because he hadn't got a hat with him. We've got one with a Feldmutzer on. We've got an NCO with his cap on, and we've got one that is wearing what is essentially a kind of cover for a British steel helmet. It's made out of Hessian material. He's wearing that as a kind of cap comforter kind of thing. So I mean, they're incredible images. I mean, the kind of study of soldiers who've just come off of a battlefield and just made prisoners of war. I mean, they're almost timeless in that. I mean, a stunning, stunning image. So these are all part of that kind of Canadian collection. And the man behind them is one, again, that we visited briefly in our talk on the Battle of the Yonne when we looked at the Canadians at Courcelette, is William Ivor Castle, who was not an old soldier. He'd not been in the military, but he was a professional photographer. He'd been given the job as one of Canada's official photographers. He'd taken a whole series of images in 1916 that had got him a reputation, including this one on the right, which shows Canadian soldiers coming back from the fighting in 1916 before Stahlhelms. So they've got lots of Pickelhaubers and various other bits of German loot that they've salvaged, probably from Courcelette, I suspect. He took a lot of those kind of images, and then in the fight for Arras, in the battle for Vimy Ridge, he went up and he took a whole load of images on the ridge itself. And where he operated, looking at the kind of geography that you see in these pictures, although there's no notes as to what Canadian units were there, and they're not detailed enough to pick out any flashes, because the Canadians wore very distinctive colour flashes on their upper sleeves, which even in black and white, you can get a sense of what potential division it might be. You can't see any of that, but I suspect this is probably in the kind of middle bit of Vimy, somewhere near to Ecure, sorry, not Ecure, the central bit of the ridge between 2nd and 3rd Canadian divisions. So just kind of south of where the main Vimy Park is today, that kind of area. But this image is an intriguing one because this is part of them. It's not in that album I've got. It shows the body of a German soldier. They say he's a casualty. I mean, I'm not sure whether he's dead or alive on that photograph, but there's two guys helping him out, and there's a soldier kind of looking over them, and then one on the left. And the one on the left is interesting because the box he's got on his back there is part of the photographic equipment that the official photographers carried. I think that had glass negatives in it, something like that. It's either for glass negatives or it's a box that the camera was carried around in. He obviously kind of picked his men to take with him, and whoever that soldier is, he's an experienced soldier because he's got his cutlery tucked in his puttees, which means as soon as he gets anywhere where there's any grub, he can whip out a spoon or a fork and he can start eating straight away. So maybe he kind of needed a few bodyguards, come experienced guys, to get him up on the battlefield. But I think that might be Castle himself. In the middle there, there's 3 pips on his uniform. I think they were given a kind of captain, honorary captain status, so they could order people around. Whether he got someone else to press the shutter so that he could be in the image, I don't know. He's not looking up at the camera. Maybe that was the kind of deal that photographers had. If they were going to be in the image themselves, then they wouldn't show their face. Or it could just be a random Canadian captain who happened to be there at that time. But it's certainly an intriguing image in terms of the kind of work of these official photographers. And then he went on to take images of the kind of wider infrastructure around the battlefield area itself. And then this is coming back from Vimy Ridge on one of the roads leading away from the ridge itself. We've got German prisoners bringing back wounded on stretchers there, being escorted. And then we've got a tramway, trench tramway, trolley taking casualties back. And that could also be used to take up equipment, ammunition, Mills bombs, everything else. And again, if you kind of look at the I mean, this is almost a subject in its own right, but if you look at the way being planned, the attack on Vimy Ridge, and his divisional commanders like Curry did the same, the investment in infrastructure that they had was enormous, making sure that there were routes up and from the front, that there were tramways like this, light railway systems, the tunnels beneath to move troops forward. It wasn't just about fixing bayonets going over the top. It wasn't just about the artillery. It was so much more. And the infrastructure and the way that infrastructure was prepared, and this image kind of gives you an insight into that, was just as important. And then back up on the ridge, he's finding Canadian troops digging in on their objectives. The Canadians used a hell of a lot of machine gun fire for this battalion, laying down proper machine gun barrages to deny the enemy ground, to suppress the enemy in their positions. And again, this is all part of the changing way that weapons were being used. It wasn't just the arrival of tanks, it wasn't just the development of artillery, it was the implementation of machine guns. They were not being used in a direct fire role really anymore. There were occasions in which that happened, but not really. They were themselves becoming part of that orchestra of battle, and they would be used increasingly like artillery themselves to lay down these machine gun barrages onto enemy positions, and something that the Germans are doing exactly the same kind of thing. So that really kind of brings us to an end of what the kind of images are out there. I mean, as the Battle of Arras moved forward, they brought down other photographers. Ernest Brooks arrived, for example, and a lot more images were taken. But that's, you know, kind of a talk for another day. But we are ending with one of my kind of favorite images of this next stage of the Battle of Arras, which shows men of the 37th Division having just returned from the fighting at Arras, boarding some old Bill buses, about to go off for a rest after a tough fight up at Arras, and it was up at Monchy, and it was a tough battle up there. Waving at the camera, saying "Cheerio, chin chin." I'm probably glad to be out of it for a few days until they returned to that battle and that battlefield, which, from the vantage point of more than a century, we can see was one of the bloodiest British battles of the First World War, where the daily casualties outstripped the Somme, would outstrip what would happen later in the year at Passchendaele even, and the units that passed through and fought in those battles, some of which we've seen depicted in these images, suffered casualties on a scale hitherto unknown, which is why when we go to that battlefield today, sandwiched as it is between the Somme and Flanders, not as frequently visited, but nevertheless full of the silent cities of the dead and that vast Arras memorial with the thousands, the tens of thousands of missing, who in many ways are kind of reflected in the images that we've seen tonight. Who knows how many of these men that we've seen on these photographs are commemorated in places like that. And I guess that's the essential part of our fascination and our continued understanding of this part of the old front line.